Welcome everybody. I'm Professor Abi Gilmore and I'm delighted to see everybody here at the event today, and I'm going to welcome you and just do a bit of housekeeping in a moment so I worked out how to use this clicker. It's really fantastic to be here, really fantastic that you've given your time to come and hear about this book that we're launching today, officially here at the University of Manchester, which is published by Manchester University Press. I have been reliably informed that there's a 30% discount at Manchester University Press. I've got a stall outside if you haven't already seen it, so please go and visit it. You'll find there's our book, Pandemic Culture, there, but also books by Sir David O'Brien and Justin O'Connor that are from recent publications by MUP. And before we start, I'd like to really thank them for all the hard work they've put into our book and publishing it. And also, I would really like to thank, in particular, Creative Manchester for organising this event, and Natalie and Anne-Marie for all of the hard work they put in marketing and putting together a fantastic spread and bringing you guys here today. Let's go on to housekeeping. Okay, so the formal stuff, no fire alarms scheduled. We're going to have a number of sessions in the programme, which we'll tell you about in a moment. But if you want to ask questions, can you hold them in your heads at the end of every panel discussion? And then there'll be also lots of time at the end to ask questions and time afterwards as well if you want to follow up with us individually. And the event is going to be recorded, so if you have any issues with this... Just my colleague John McAuliffe, I was just going to send his apologies, but he's just turned up here, so let's all point at him and wave. Professor John McAuliffe, Director of Creative Manchester, was going to welcome you to the event, but you were delayed through teaching, so thanks for coming, John. So the event is being recorded. Only the speakers do the microphones. I'm just testing my microphone technique. Apologies if it's not great yet. Okay, thanks, Ben. So if you have any problems with your voice sort of appearing when we come to questions, then just be aware of that. If you've got a question and you don't want to be recorded, then we can also, please ask the question and we can just take it out afterwards. Okay. And really that's all of the housekeeping, I believe. So we can move on to the agenda. And first of all, we just wanted to open up, kind of give you a bit of a brief introduction to the book with my colleagues here, Ben and Dave, and then we'll have a panel with some of the researchers. We'll hear in a moment how many researchers are involved in this project, and we're really delighted that we have some talking in the first panel and reflecting on the findings of the research, and have a coffee break, and then we'll have some really important insights and inputs from people from policy and practice who have been involved in the research or have had a chance to look at the findings and think about their implications for the arts and cultural sector now, but also into the future, and then we'll have other questions at the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ben Wolsey. Over to you, Ben, to kind of kick things off.
Have the next slide, please. Where the slide? Okay, hi everyone. Welcome. Great to see a really packed room and a beautiful day in Manchester, which isn't a phrase I would say very often. So we've got to get the Leeds joke in already. I thought it might be good to kind of kick off this by reflecting back of, why the hell we undertook this crazy project in the middle of a pandemic. And I guess we were spurred, partly by a rapid call that came out from UKRI that had an incredible kind of 6-week turnaround, I think, wasn't it? So we basically had 6 weeks to get to build a huge consortium of researchers to kind of define and refine our research questions and to build up what we hoped would be a really kind of ambitious bid to do this work. And we did it partly, certainly from my perspective, at the time I was leading the relatively, or the very new Centre for Cultural Values. So we'd been operating since the 1st of October. Obviously the pandemic hit kind of mid-March time. And I think, encouraged particularly by our funders, so you're going to hear from Andrew certainly later on from the Arts Council, we had this real sense of if we were going to deliver anything of use to the cultural sector over the next 5 years, which was our remit, we really needed to understand what exactly was happening in terms of the pandemic, how organisations and different subsectors were kind of riding the waves of that pandemic through the first few months of it. So we thought that unless we researched with the sector itself, we would never be in a position to really understand what was happening and therefore to be of any use to the sector. Without kind of labouring it or trotting out all truisms, it was clearly a game-changing moment for everybody, wasn't it? And I guess as researchers, we knew that we wanted to capture what was happening as it was happening in real time. And those of you who aren't academics have probably often, scoffed at academics for publishing work 4 or 5 years after the actual thing has taken place and for sitting on research for a very long time. And I remember a really scary moment quite early on in the research where DCMS said to us, look, you can't do that. We need answers in real time if you're going to make a difference. So I think that was quite exposing. We suddenly felt we had to share findings almost before they emerged, not even as they were emerging, and kind of react on the top of our heads rather than having the comfort of sitting on research and doing lots of meta-analysis over 5 years. So it put us in a very vulnerable position, but at the same time it was a unique opportunity to work with particularly policymakers in a fundamentally different way. You both are doing that now, of course. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. But for me, that was a pretty new and exceptional opportunity to work with policymakers and to have their ear. So we used to meet with DCMS every quarter. I think we were certainly motivated, and there were 35 of us at one point working on this project. So it was kind of unwieldy in a really good way. We never met. I still haven't met, I think, 1 or 2 people in person who worked on that project. So it was all done online, and I think, as Abi noted in the introduction, we were going through this ourselves, of course, sitting at home in a pandemic, in various lockdowns, particularly in the Northwest. But we were motivated by this, I think, really rare ability as academics to make a positive difference in real time and to show how research can be useful to the sector and to funders and to policymakers. And I think finally, we just really felt an obligation and a responsibility to capture the real, the challenges that people were going through. We felt really privileged, I think, to hear the stories of what people were going through. It was really, really challenging to hear people, break down in interviews and people who were on the verge of nervous breakdowns, and it was incredibly rare situation. But we ultimately, and I hope we captured this in the book, wanted to kind of document what was happening in order to learn some lessons and to come up with some recommendations and to have ultimately, I guess, argue for a healthier, more sustainable cultural sector. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Dave to say a bit more about how we did it.
I mean, Ben has touched on some of the things on the slide behind me in terms of the range of individuals involved in the consortium. I want to flag maybe 2 things. One is that there's a kind of cliche in contemporary academic work that everything is interdisciplinary, everything is multidisciplinary, everything is cross-disciplinary. This was one of those projects where that was genuinely true, and it was a quite remarkable, really, meeting of not just the kind of great houses of quantitative and qualitative approaches to thinking about what was going on, but a real blend of different research methods, different research philosophies, different kind of orientations towards the world that went on across the project team. And this ranged from people who were working directly on how policy gets made, thinking about kind of policy processes, working with documents, through individuals doing quantitative research, as Ben has mentioned, in as real time as it's almost kind of possible to do with contemporary large-scale survey data sets, through, again, as Ben has highlighted, to people doing interview fieldwork, and people thinking about, I suppose, the practices and the kind of contours of institutions, both in terms of the individuals within them, but also what institutions were doing and how institutions were responding and experiencing the pandemic. This, I think, is captured in the book, and the range of chapters gives a sense of this, but also actually within the chapters themselves you get a sense of that crossover and that kind of blend of different approaches to research. The other thing I think that I'd quite like to bring in is place. So one of the things that I think came through in the pandemic was mainly in media discourses, but it came up in policy a little bit as well, was a kind of a sense of, everywhere is experiencing this all at the same time, all kind of together. And actually one of the things we tried to do with the research was to say there are distinctions, there are distinctive experiences, distinctive responses, and these things were not just at kind of national scale. So we've got an attentiveness to Wales, to Northern Ireland, to England, and to Scotland, who had different lockdown regulations, different political parties, different governments who viewed, I suppose, kind of responsibilities and relationships with the art and cultural sectors differently, but also with the focus on Manchester within the project, a sense of what was going on in real time in a particular place that has, we might say, an incredibly strong track record of foregrounding arts and culture in civic life, but at the same time I'm an employee of the University of Manchester, so I don't want to get too much into their practices towards lockdowns and students and stuff like that, but had unique challenges as well. And again, we tried to kind of bring that out in the book in a way that, I guess, going back to where I started, that blend of multi-interdisciplinary approaches sometimes struggles with place and to do kind of an attentiveness to place, but I think it's something we really kind of did well in this work. And you can read more in the book, obviously.
Yeah, I think chapter 2, maybe. So I was just going to quickly say something which you've heard a little bit about already, which was that one of the things that we feel is unique about the project as a national study that tried to be as fair as possible to the different devolved nations and to try to reflect on different regional and spatial characteristics of the impacts of the pandemic, was that we had a very strong engagement with policy, as well as with practitioners as research partners and also as research participants through the many interviews and also case studies. So we were lucky that even though everything was remote, policymakers and funders were happy to host researchers on placements with us for the project, and that was a really useful way of trying to have that kind of lived experience of knowing what it's like to be in that very difficult position that everybody was in trying to work out how to react. As Ben said, there was kind of expectation that we could somehow dish out figures and numbers and the kind of thing that policy likes. And we did to a certain extent, and you'll hear from Anne later about the work that the Audience Agency did in terms of kind of really tracking and understanding behaviour. But we also had the quantitative statistics on workforce occupation, which we could report on. So we were doing that kind of real-time analysis. But actually, in terms of thinking about the lived experience and how to make decisions, I think we were using the same boat. So we tried our best to, and one of the ways that we could do that was by assigning researchers to actually contribute to kind of policy practice through their placements. We also held those regular quarterly workshops or meetings with DCMS, and we had an amazing policy reference group that represented cross-sector and cross-national interests, and that also worked very hard in terms of helping us to hone the recommendations from the report. We also worked closely with Culture Commons as a research partner, and they helped us produce both the two-day conference, which was amazing, and recorded event online. Plus we had a public-facing report, which is still up there on our dedicated web space on Culture Hive. The Centre for Cultural Value really, again, did an amazing job in terms of being able to put out sort of briefing papers and blog posts again, as close to real time as we possibly could make it. And those resources still stand there today. And we use things like Delphi method to try to prioritise research. And then, of course, we've got the book, which is open access, paid for through the Research Council. We hope that it is in a digestible. We'd welcome any feedback, actually, about how you find reading it if you're not an academic. It was an opportunity for us to think through in a more theoretical and considered way what the implications might be for policy and practice more broadly, rather than just trying to spit out evidence that might help decision making. But at the same time, we'd really welcome your feedback on its usefulness, and that's what we're hoping to discuss with the rest of the day. So on that note, I'd like to call up our first panel, which is let's stay up. And move that out the way. So I have a clicker which I'm going to pass down the line to you, Ben, and then we need to pass it along. We'll follow the order for this panel, and these are all the people that have been working. If you want to go back. Okay. Right, okay. We'll just move through the order as it was on the slide, and Ben, over to you to talk through around kind of the theatre sector and the findings in the book.
Thank you, Abi. So I think we've got 5 minutes per chapter, so this is going to be a kind of roller coaster of findings. I'll try not to speak too quickly, because that'll be useless. So this was conducted by myself and Karen Gray, with some help from Maria Barrett at the University of Warwick. It was based on over 50 interviews that we did with a whole range of theatre organisations, ranging from the National Theatre through to theatre freelancers, so across the whole of England in this case. Other art forms covered other of the 4 nations. We focused on England. And as Dave was saying before, we were in a really lucky position, I guess, to be able to also draw on some brilliant findings from the audience agencies, Cultural Participation Monitor, more of that anon, plus the work that Dave led from the Labour Force Survey and ONS data analysis, to really kind of get a holistic view of what was happening, or to get some oversight of what was happening with theatre in England. I think, pre the pandemic, it's fair to say that theatre was perceived to be a really resilient and sustainable sector, and in pretty good health. And all these terms were banded around about, it being world-leading. The National Theatre in particular was extolled, wasn't it, for having a kind of perfect business model that was only, I think, 25% reliant on public subsidy. So it was, I guess all of that kind of fluff, in a way, hid what a lot of us knew were going on negatively, and some of Dave and Mark Taylor's and Orion's work had really exposed before the pandemic. But I think theatre was perceived to be in a pretty healthy state, is what I'm trying to say. And then, of course, the pandemic came and really exposed all of those cracks and all of those inequalities and, the blatant racism, not least, at play in the sector very, very quickly, didn't it? And so one of the first things that we heard, of course, was how very quickly the already kind of disenfranchised and marginalised areas of the theatre sector were hit by the pandemic. So whether that was, people on 0 hours contracts at the National Theatre who were made redundant absolutely immediately, through to, kind of very logistical problems of how on earth you shut down something like the National Theatre in one afternoon with absolutely no advice or support from government. And how you get the tone right with vulnerable staff, with vulnerable audiences, and to shut down a venue that hadn't ever been shut down in its history. So this was all unprecedented. And we almost forgot, it was such an obvious finding, we almost forgot to put it in a book, I did actually. But just this fact of how chaotic that first day or the first 2 days were. And I think one of the findings that come out of the book more broadly was about the strength of networks and how, we talk about Manchester in particular, but how because of the very established strong tie networks in Manchester, there was that kind of peer support that enabled venues to call each other and go, what the hell are you doing, what do we do, what's working, what's happening. So there's a lot more information circulating in real time in Manchester than there certainly was in London and elsewhere in the country. I mean, what the chapter does do is, of course, trace the impact, certainly over the first 6 months when we were interviewing people. So we tended to interview some key figures twice or 3 times over the pandemic. So, you know, we also drew on secondary data like UK Theatre and Salt that showed that over 15,000 performances were cancelled in the first 6 months, and over £300 million was lost in box office revenue. But I guess, you know, kind of almost a cliche now, isn't it? But the kind of agility of the performing arts sector was really, really spotlighted, wasn't it? And we saw some fantastic innovation, I think particularly in terms of civic engagement. The classic examples, of course, are National Theatre with National Theatre at Home, really trying to pioneer a kind of subscription model, and again, a radical departure in its marketing from saying theatre is a collective experience to something that you can enjoy at home on your sofa. So the whole marketing philosophy of certainly the National Theatre changed quite quickly. You know, other examples, of course, Long Low, we had kind of repurposing of production logistics being used to develop really effective food banks in Holbeck in Leeds. But I think just the creativity that lots of theatre organisations and artists brought to, you know, gaps in education, for example, to really creative responses to supporting their local communities and to finally realising that they had an important community role to play, actually. So we saw a kind of explosion, I guess, in business model innovation. We heard stories of board members being drafted in to support really, really poor HR structures in particular. So even, you know, significant organisations who had very, very little experience, you know, people who've never had to make anyone redundant before, for example, never mind deal with furlough. So board members suddenly became absolutely pivotal to supporting organisations through, again, this unprecedented situation. There were, of course, controversial ventures. The Nightingale Court, so one of our case studies was the Lowry, and kind of all of that complexity that they had to navigate of whether or not, I think jury's still out, without going to con, whether or not that was the right response to deal with that financial situation. So there are 3 case studies in the book. There's Theatre Absolute, some of you will know, a very small entity based in Coventry. There's the Lowry, and then there's the National Theatre. So again, we wanted to get a really representative range of scale and geographies in that. And I think ultimately our conclusion, unsurprisingly, and I guess this will be a recurrent trope of the day, is that we need a radical rethink of the theatre sector in particular, a sector that is, you know, reliant on 70% of freelancers for its very existence. And I think pre-pandemic that was ignored and kind of, you know, comfortably overlooked by powers that be. And I just want to end with this quote, really, that I think is some of the problems of the sector quite tellingly. So someone said to us, "Why am I working in theatre? It doesn't offer any security. It's a mad industry to work in anyway, and then to have something happen, I guess." So on that positive note, I'll hand over to David.
Okay, so my chapter is co-authored with Harry Weeks and Karen Gray, and John also undertook some of the interview research as well. So we did around 36 interviews across roughly 19 institutions in the northeast and the northwest of England, and these were arts organisations, museums and galleries. They ranged from large museums and galleries through to local authority institutions, artist studios and artist-led organisations. So we tried to get a broad range of the kind of arts organisations. Obviously some of these were more difficult than others, with staff on furlough and limited staffing, but we tried to reach a broader range as we could. We spoke to staff at different levels within these institutions. So we started our first round of interviews with people at director level, and then we tried to speak to learning and engagement teams where possible, curators, and people who were still kind of on the ground and doing things within the institutions. So the chapter really takes this broad range of interview data and also focuses on 3 case studies. And one of the things that we found in the interviews is that the kind of the civic turn during the pandemic was really important, and we found that those institutions who were really engaged in the civic role loosely fell into 3 categories. So we had the kind of large-scale arts organisations, we had the smaller, kind of consciously socially engaged art institutions, and we had urban museum and museum groups who were normally tied to local authorities. So we chose our 3 case studies from these 3 groups that we found that they most fully to use the kind of pandemic term pivoted towards their civic functions. So the first was a major art gallery in an urban centre. The second case study is a small embedded local arts organisation which had Arts Council England National Portfolio Organisation status in a post-industrial town in a semi-rural area. And the final one was the local authority museum, which sits on the boundary of a fairly affluent area and one of kind of relative deprivation. So there was a lot of kind of families there who experience second and third generation unemployment. So this term civic responsibility became quite important for us. There were repeated references across the interviews to the idea of use and necessity, that people felt that they were, someone said something like, we're really of use now, how can we be useful to our immediate communities? And so we consider these 3 case studies and some of the broader things coming out of the wider range of interviews in relation to pre-COVID-19 discourse on the civic role of arts organisations, which comes out of the Gulbenkian Foundation's inquiry, and also the idea of the useful museum, which those of you who are in Manchester will be familiar with Alistair Hudson's kind of discourse around this. This is not to say that any of our interviewees acknowledged the idea of the useful museum. It wasn't mentioned in the institutions that weren't aligned with that. But these are kind of framings that we thought were important to draw out when, in an emergency kind of pandemic situation, use becomes really a priority for these institutions. So our findings were basically that there were 4 key shifts that happened as a result of the pandemic. The first one was that civic work became increasingly important, particularly in the larger and more secure organisations, and those that had a pre-existing commitment to social engagement. So the 3 case studies all had some kind of previous tie-in to their local communities, to social practice in some ways. But the pandemic kind of heightened this. So this is the second thing. There was a heightened focus on localism, and as some of our interviewees actually termed it, hyper-localism. So how do we serve our immediate communities? How can we be useful for the people who are outside our doors? The third shift that we found is that the work has largely been framed in terms of utility, and this is a distinction again from the useful museum. So it's a utility of the organisations. And the final aspect was that the underlying impetus in this shift lies in institutions feeling a sense of civic responsibility, which we distinguish from civic role, because civic role was very much about people wanting to kind of buy into this idea of engaging in their local communities. Within the interviewees, people felt it was a necessity, we have to be useful. And so these are the main findings within museums and galleries in the Northwest and the Northeast of England.
Thank you, Dan. If you can pass over now to John.
Yes. I think this one works.
Pointed at something. That's you.
So, hi everybody. So I'm going to talk about 2 topics. So the first one is festivals in Scotland that I was looking at, and the second one is about cultural leadership in Northern Ireland and kind of what emerged during and in response to the pandemic. And that chapter is co-written with Dr. Alec Skinner, who can't be here today, but kind of gave us a lot of information about what was happening on the ground in Northern Ireland at the time. So, I'm going to really talk through the key findings, but these were all about kind of based on the kind of deep in-depth interviews, as Ben was saying, but actually we went back to these festivals and these cultural leaders at different points as well. So there's a kind of shift that was happening where we're having to kind of deal with that really fine, actually. So what became apparent really in Scotland when it came to the festivals was that there was this shift, immediate shift, towards community, as Danny was kind of alluding to a little bit. But actually community that was of these places, which actually where the festivals came from in the first instance, where we found that they were developed from and for. So there was this kind of interesting relationship kind of going on there. And actually Dave kind of talked about this a little bit before, this idea of place, which came around really strongly in the interviews about this sense of belonging to a place in different ways, in complex ways. But to kind of sort of move that a little bit, we also found that a lot of the festivals were taking advantage of that placeness and marketing themselves in that way, especially to kind of expat communities that they were able to connect with for the first time because of the way that the digital infrastructure was being forced to be developed, really. And this is a thing that was really kind of obvious in the initial interviews, was that they were working through this really kind of complex set of skills that were needed to do this. And that talks to my sort of last point, second to last point here, which is really this rapid kind of development of technology. For example, we found some festivals developed ticketing systems, digital ticketing systems for the first time from scratch, which actually was a real complete and utter nightmare for a lot of them. But actually at the same time, it developed the infrastructure overall. And what we found was that there was a real mismatch between the kind of the funding that was coming in to support that and actually what the festivals are doing on the ground. And sort of going forward, that is also a problem currently in the kind of cultural policy space for festivals in Scotland. The final point on this slide, so I don't ramble on really, is that a lot of new relationships were developed between festivals, and this isn't just kind of geographic locations, but sort of across Scotland. We found that there was a lot of relationships in kind of art form, but also kind of size of festival and similarities. So a lot of festivals in the Highlands and Islands, for example, would kind of speak to each other about what you do, how you pay freelancers in this kind of situation, and what can be done to kind of bring in any kind of socially distanced kind of tents, etc. When the actual lockdowns changed slightly, rules-wise. And that was another thing with Scotland as well. The rules were different in different tiers, different areas, so it was very kind of complex from that point of view. But a final sort of point on the kind of Scottish situation was that actually a lot of the festivals became dormant, and there was a little bit of kind of tension between some of the festivals that were really able to kind of force a kind of public engagement through a digital infrastructure that was often always there in those festivals already, and they built that up over time, between those that didn't have that and were kind of really locally run, and they just couldn't kind of deal with that. So I think there was also tension in that kind of relationship as well. I'll move quickly on. So you can talk to me about this afterwards as well, because this is really rapid. I've got two. There we go. Excellent. So what was special, in a sense, about Northern Ireland and the situation was actually that this chapter, if you're going to read it, is really about kind of the historic context in Northern Ireland. That actually we discovered through a lot of kind of secondary research, but also through the interviews themselves, that there's a kind of history of this kind of collaboration that comes together during a crisis, and actually falls away after the crises as abated, and it kind of goes back into the usual hierarchies and power structures afterwards. But what we found was that there was this kind of set of networks that developed and kind of converged with each other across sector, with different policymakers at different levels, especially Belfast City Council were very noticeable. But actually what happened was a kind of national task force was developed during this period, and an idea of it quite early on actually. in the interviews. But then also there was a kind of threat that some of the funding, kind of COVID response funding, would be kind of taken. Because the actual, within the kind of, there's a thing called kind of barnet formation, and actually some of the funding that was ring-fenced elsewhere wasn't in Northern Ireland. So a lot of the kind of confluence of these networks was really about lobbying that situation. And actually they were successful in that, and they managed to get this funding. But what really kind of came through in the interviews and what was really rich was this sense of kind of mutual support. And this idea that there's a lot of kind of power relations in Northern Ireland, a kind of complex socio-political situation, but also this idea that if you start to lead a sex-to-voice situation, it can immediately become this kind of binary situation where there's a lot of hostility. And so this network really kind of, it was called the Arts Collaboration Network, and actually it managed to sort of dance across the line between those two things. And to kind of sort of wrap up really, it was a real challenge for the kind of interpersonal skills that these leaders had to kind of engage with, and actually burnout came later on in the interviews towards the end, where they were actually exhausted. The secretary was exhausted. It was literally people were crying in these interviews. It was absolutely awful. And what it is it's in the Northern Ireland situation, it's starting from a place that was already underfunded compared to the other nations in the UK. So there was this extra layer of kind of hurt, really. So I'm going to end on that.
Thank you, John. And next, last but not least, in terms of our chapter orders, we've got Dan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no. Where am I meant to be pointing?
At me.
With John. Yeah, that'd be fortunate. With the middle button.
There you go.
Oh, just a minute. Yeah, it's really interesting to be reminded of all the focus in this research project, but also some of the language that we have in common across these different chapters. But like I think Ben was saying at the beginning, perhaps it was Dave, the specificity that comes when you're looking at specific examples within this broader field, and that's what this chapter really focuses on. So this chapter was written with Abi, and Abi and I developed a case study of Greater Manchester specifically. So that's the Combined Authority, GMCA, but also an effort to understand the impacts of the pandemic across the 10 local authorities that make up the region. And we describe our approach in the chapter as an ecosystems approach, or an ecosystems analysis of the city region. So an ecosystems approach to place-based research. And that was really informed by the context itself. So perhaps you know, perhaps you don't, but there's a long history of cross-authority collaboration within the city region, and also close connection between culture and local authority strategies. And so in an effort to try and develop a strong and comprehensive view of what was happening in this place, we did interviews, we worked with local partners, policy partners, but also interviews and workshops with a whole range of culture sector stakeholders. Everybody from policymakers and policy partners, right through to freelance cultural workers. And there was a few different aims here, partly to get an indication of how the pandemic was being experienced by people at all of these different levels, but also to document how each of these stakeholders were involved and affected as the region developed its response to the pandemic. So in terms of what we found out about the specificity of place here, in many ways, the immediate response within Greater Manchester, the immediate reaction was very similar to other contexts across the 4 UK nations. So our interviewees described shock and panic as venues closed, and deep frustration with guidance and decision-making from national government. But very quickly, the specificities, the unique characteristics of this place began to emerge in the interviews as well. And what we were beginning to look at here was the resilience and the resources that were offered by the region's history of partnership working. And that was really what began to set it apart from other contexts in the 4 UK nations, and to separate its experience of and response to the pandemic. So a couple of quick specific examples. GMCA and MCC, so Manchester City Council, consulted with pre-existing cultural networks to inform their decisions really early on in the pandemic to suspend monitoring and reporting requirements for their culturally funded organisations, reassuring cultural organisations that they would continue to receive funding. And that introduced a level of stability, of assurance within this context that wasn't available to cultural organisations in many other contexts in the UK, enabling the sector to think carefully and strategically about the resources that they had and how they might be used. And that partnership work also provided the groundwork for creative solutions, creative thinking and problem solving that brought together, like Ben was saying earlier, all these different areas of, I guess, the ways in which different people were impacted and affected. Think about how responses from the cultural sector might link those together. So, for instance, the SCC, so Salford City Council, who was one of our research partners as well, worked with pre-existing cultural and corporate partners to develop a programme of activity that linked a response to the impacts for the cultural sector organisations specifically with the impacts for the hospitality sector as well. Doing things like using culture to draw people back into what had been commercial spaces and now were perhaps being reframed as cultural places, and to use culture to try and address these linked issues and these linked experiences of the pandemic within this context. And developments like these were linked to what we observed as a shift in how decisions were being made. So while the kinds of responses I was just explaining, they rely on pre-existing cultures, partnership work and collaboration, it also signalled a significant change from what one of our interviewees described as the competitive barriers that had existed between organisations prior to the pandemic. Instead, organisations, I thought it was recorded, but it wasn't, it was just a chair. Instead, organisations shifted their language to talk about serving the city, so serving place and serving communities, positioning that objective as the basis for how they responded to various stages of the pandemic, which is perhaps another way of articulating something around the civic term that Danny was discussing as well. And we discussed this as a shift away from outcomes-based decision-making towards values-led decision-making that relied on shared goals and an understanding of resources circulating and recirculating within an interconnected, localised cultural ecosystem, as opposed to providing value or benefit for individual organisations, for instance. And the last theme that we look at in the chapter that I'm going to mention here is a turn towards place and community in the practice of cultural organisations. So for most of the organisations that we spoke to, this interest in serving the city involved a turn towards place and locality. And there's an obvious pragmatism here. In the context of a pandemic, you need to reach towards the closest audiences who can still access your work. But what came through in the interviews was a much more attentive and responsive ethic, an interest in understanding how people close to specific organisations were experiencing the pandemic, and a reconsideration of responsibility of cultural organisations that drew attention to local people, local audiences, and local barriers to cultural participation. So, the three main themes, roughly, along with others, that we explore in the chapter: prominence of partnership work, the values that inform decision-making within these contexts, and the practical turn towards place and community. And in the first instance, I think we can characterise these as positive findings. Partnership work led and supported by local authorities drew on relationships with cultural organisations to fill gaps left by national initiatives like the Cultural Recovery Fund. And yet, our partners describe these as proof of concept, not a fundamental change in how culture is being understood and practiced in this area. And in our interviews towards the end of the project, as the sector was reopening, there was an indication of a return towards a more siloed, more competitive model of cultural practice and practice in the cultural sector that we had pre-pandemic. So there's a lot to learn here. It speaks to the strengths of devolved decision-making, collaborative decision-making, devolved power, and those emerged in the context of the pandemic. But there's clearly a lot more to understand here in terms of what it might mean to reconfigure contexts like this, to think through an ecosystem's approach to cultural planning, policy and delivery, and that requires continued buy-in from local authorities and cultural partners too.
Thank you very much, Ben. There will be time for questions and comments shortly, but before then, and sitting very patiently, thank you, Andy Mola from Arts Council of England is going to give us some reflections on the book itself and the findings, and perhaps something about kind of the future implications or implications for research that is necessary with and for the sector. So if you can say something like that, Andy, that's great. If not, don't worry. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Abi. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. It's a real privilege to be asked to respond to the challenges set out in this book, especially at this important symposium, as we reflect on the immense challenges our sector has faced over the past few years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic not only disrupted our lives, but also laid bare the vulnerabilities and inequalities present in the cultural sector. Freelancers and independent artists in particular felt the brunt of the financial strain, while many organisations, especially smaller and grassroots ones, faced existential challenges. At the same time, the crisis accelerated new forms of digital innovation and engagement, revealing both opportunities and shortcomings in how we reach our audiences. What this book describes very well is the profound and multifaceted impact of COVID-19 on the UK cultural sector. It makes for sobering reading, as the book concludes how the pandemic exacerbated existing inequalities within the cultural sector. Organisations that were already struggling before the pandemic were hit hardest, while larger and better funded organisations fared better in navigating the crisis. Freelancers and independent artists, particularly in sectors like theatre and live events, faced severe disruptions due to work and income. It sets out how the cultural workforce experienced dramatic changes, with job losses, reduced working hours and widespread uncertainty. It highlights the vulnerability of cultural workers, particularly those on precarious contracts or without job security. Many workers left the sector altogether during the pandemic, leading to long-term implications for workforce sustainability. It sets out how audience engagement during the pandemic shifted, with many people consuming culture online. However, the book emphasises that this shift largely benefited already engaged audiences, while those less connected to cultural activities before the pandemic were even more excluded during the crisis. Finally, it sets out how the pandemic accelerated digital innovation across the cultural sector, but the transition to online platforms was uneven. Some organisations thrived in the digital space, while others struggled to adapt. The book emphasises that while digital engagement is important and has potential, it cannot replace the value of in-person experiences, and hybrid models will likely become a key feature of the sector's future. I'd like to take a moment to reflect on Arts Council England's response to the crisis. We made £160 million of emergency funding available for organisations and individuals who needed immediate support. We made £20 million available to artists, creative practitioners and freelancers who would apply for up to £2,500. We made £50 million available to organisations outside of the national portfolio who could apply for up to £35,000. And we made £90 million available to national portfolio organisations and lead creative people and place organisations. Nearly half of those who received funding would not have survived the first 6 months of the pandemic without the ERF funding. Of those who said they would have survived without the ERF, most said they would have had to reduce the scale and intensity of their creative practice. Looking back, the Cultural Recovery Fund was a vital intervention for the UK cultural sector, but we know now its effectiveness varied depending on the type of organisation and region. On one hand, the CRF provided critical financial support, preventing the collapse of many cultural institutions during the height of the pandemic. With £1.57 billion in funding, it helped organisations maintain operations, preserve jobs and keep venues viable. According to DCMS, the fund supported over 5,000 organisations across the country. However, there were challenges of the fund's distribution. Established institutions, particularly those with a history of public funding, benefited more from the CRF, while smaller and independent organisations faced challenges in accessing the funds. Freelancers were among the most affected by the pandemic, but largely left out of direct financial support. The book concludes that the pandemic highlighted the need for greater sustainability in the cultural sector. The crisis prompted reflection on organisational models, leadership and the role of culture in society. And moving forward, the sector needs to address issues of diversity, accessibility, better data gathering and resilience to be better prepared for future crises. At Arts Council England, we have taken several steps to address disparities in access to funding by developing more inclusive and flexible funding models, and key initiatives include our strategy, Let's Create, which emphasises inclusivity, accessibility and diversity. The strategy is designed to ensure that cultural investment reaches more communities and underrepresented groups. It prioritises projects that reflect a wide range of voices and places and aims to distribute funds more equitably across different regions, particularly those historically underserved by public funding. Our National Lottery project grants, which are specifically designed to be more flexible and accessible. These grants support a broad range of cultural activities and are open to both individual artists and organisations. To increase inclusivity, we simplify the application process, reduce the time taken for decisions, and focused on supporting diverse, community-focused projects, including those from underrepresented groups such as ethnic minorities, disabled artists, and LGBTQ+ communities. To address the criticisms that larger, more established organisations tend to benefit from public funding, we have sought to rebalance the distribution of funds. In recent years, we have expanded funding opportunities for smaller, grassroots and independent cultural organisations, especially those outside of London. Programmes like Creative People and Places focus on empowering communities and supporting cultural projects in areas that have historically received less investment. We have placed an increasing emphasis on diversity and inclusion within our funding processes. This includes prioritising applications from organisations that demonstrate a commitment to cultural diversity and working with marginalised communities. The goal is to make the sector more reflective of the diversity of modern England, both in terms of the work being produced and the organisations receiving public funding. To conclude, at Arts Council England, we recognise that this moment requires both reflection and action. The work outlined in Pandemic Culture offers a comprehensive view of the sector's experiences and will guide our efforts as we continue to support recovery. It reminds us of the critical importance of equity, sustainability and resilience, values that are at the heart of Let's Create. Our goal is to ensure that public investment benefits every part of the cultural landscape, from large institutions to the freelancers and independent workforce, and that our recovery from this pandemic leaves no one behind. I look forward to engaging with the issues raised in this important book and discussing how we can collectively build a more inclusive, flexible and robust cultural sector.
Thank you very much, Andy. Quick round of applause for all. We have a very short time before coffee, so I'd like to invite any questions or comments. We have one here.
Hiya, is there anything in the book about libraries? I work in Leeds, and the libraries were some of the last places to close, some of the first places to reopen, and I think they get overlooked a little bit. I did a review of Culture is Bad for You for a literary journal earlier this year, and the stats in there for speaking about barriers to careers in the arts and cultural sectors, and the kind of anecdotal stuff and the stats for people who their only access to that as young people, like it was for me, was through libraries. There's some research that I'm kind of peripherally involved in at the moment about working class readers and working class writers, and it's something like 75% of people that have responded to the survey so far have said that, again, like libraries are the only way that they were able to access any kind of cultural provision as kind of young people trying to get into any of the creative industries. So I was just wondering if anyone's got any thoughts on that, or whether that was kind of touched on in the book at all, because it is something that I think libraries just get the short end of the stick all the time. Like, they do so much, and it just doesn't always get taken into account, I don't think.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some of that. Ben, do you want to? Ben's, and then maybe we could hear from Andrew as well in terms of Arts Council England's relationship with libraries. That's okay? Yeah, so thanks for raising that. I completely agree with you, and know from previous research, if not this particular research project, that libraries and their place in communities is absolutely essential as part of cultural infrastructure that was supported by local government and is the only kind of statutory duty for local government in terms of cultural services. So we had to make some very quick decisions about the focus for the resources that we could get, which was then delayed by the Research Council far longer than we wanted to in terms of starting the project, but we had to make some decisions about which sectors we focused on, and so we didn't identify libraries as a specific sector that we were looking at. That said, we did include consideration of them, particularly within the ecosystem study in Greater Manchester, and we're fully aware of the role. So the quick answer is that there isn't a specific place in the book that you can read about that. Apart from David's just signalling to me for the purpose of the recording, there's a little bit in the content. There is, in terms of cultural occupations, there's some relevant data there about the impact. I think going forward in terms of broader national culture policy, I'm hopeful that there is a place for libraries, and that's a really important opportunity for more equitable access to cultural provision in all kinds of ways. And we know that in Manchester as well, not least the kind of jewel in our crown in Manchester Library Services, the Central Library, which has incredible digital and performance provision and forms a great heart, but also the many branch libraries, which are cultural sector organisations often work with. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Not in relation to the research itself, but all I will say from Arts Council England is that when you look at the data, the actual use of library usage has actually gone down. But then you think about, you delve deeper into the actual data itself, and you look at the, how marginalised communities are using libraries, and that's actually on the increase. So fundamentally, they are so important for Arts Council England in us being able to realise the ambitions set out in Let's Create. So they're fundamentally important. We're going to work with local authorities to make sure that, we know that the funding environment is particularly difficult out there, but Arts Council England recognises the importance of libraries within their local community, and that's going to continue right through to the end of the current strategy.
Thank you. Time for any other quick questions. I'll take two together if that's okay, so that we don't dig too much into the coffee break. So, come to you first, and then next to you, Laura. Is that okay?
Thank you so much. First of all, congratulations for this work. The question is quite simple. I'm wondering if in the book you also talk about the importance for mental health, that all these services needs to remain open for society and also for artists. I have to do a contrast. I'm a physician, also a pianist. I work my team work in Mexico City creating the temporary COVID hospital for the city. And also I never miss any concert from the symphonic. But I also see that in Mexico happened the contrary of what happened here. We didn't have this kind of analysis or this kind of opportunity to share with all the parts of the society what is happening and importance to be connected and working together in order to adapt for a pandemic. And I congratulate you and all the team at the university, because I think it's really important, and this is an example of what we need to do as a society, not only in culture, but also in the rest of the branch. Thanks so much.
Thank you for those comments. And kind of consideration of mental health, presumably both for cultural sector workers and for broader communities and culture. Quick one?
Well, yeah. It's never quick with me, but and that is going to come for the next bit anyway. But it was just coming back to the point about workforce actually, because so I was an area council for Arts Council England during the whole of lockdown, and actually I have to say it's amazing working with the Arts Council how quickly you can get funding out the door when you need to, but also that was to do with the staff that were working at Arts Council at the time, so emergency funding coming out, we were meeting every 2 weeks as area councils nationally. But sitting in a meeting where everyone was really shocked at the number of people, global majorities, that were made redundant in lockdown, was not a shock to anyone that was from a global majority background, I can tell you that, because the people that got made redundant were domestic staff, front of house. Yeah, so and basically nobody in senior management, I think less than 11% of NPOs have, I know all the arts council data, global majority chief execs or artistic directors, so that never changed. And if you look at the most recent data, it possibly might actually be even worse. So, well, because everyone's at an apprenticeship level, it's never at that. So I think there's more of a comment that actually I looked back at the panel that we did in 21 on this, and the data is exactly the same.
Really quick one.
Yeah, I mean, I briefly touched on that, and certainly in the National Theatre case study, that really came across the kind of nuance of how racism and you know, institutionalised racism played out. And at the time, I think, ironically, they were kind of very proud of developing a diversity strategy, and then the pandemic hit. And of course, you know, who was most hit by the pandemic immediately was front of house staff, the vast majority of whom were black. Whereas the finance department were, I think, kind of predominantly Asian, so it was really complex. But yeah, you know, the diversity figures of the National Theatre staff took a massive hit, and have never recovered. On mental health, I mean, it's threaded throughout the book, isn't it? And I think one of the things we really, I don't know how successfully, but really tried to push in our regular meetings with DCMS was the mental health, I was going to say looming, but it now is very real, isn't it? The mental health crisis in the sector. And we were really being pushed towards, you know, what is the economic scarring, what proportion of freelancers are going to come back to the sector. We had no idea in the middle of 2020. What we did know is that, you know, the mental health crisis in the sector was not sustainable and that people were leaving in droves. At the same time, I suppose we heard so many stories of how that kind of, you know, pivot to civic, as we called it, was really kind of highlighting and showing exactly how arts and culture can act as solace in times of, you know, in times of crisis like the pandemic. So yeah, it's kind of writ large, I think, all over the book, isn't it, from beginning to end. And I hope what we try to do is capture the kind of solace that arts and culture can offer to audiences, but also the very, very severe impacts that a crisis like COVID can have on the workforce that's already incredibly kind of suffering from structural inequalities and overworking and unsustainable practices. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on those two points.
Yeah. I think, if we may, we'll go to a coffee break now because we're already 5 minutes into it. But I'd like to thank again our panellists. And yeah, it says here 2:50. I think if we're okay, just to grab a quick breath of fresh air or coffee and come back for 2:15, and then we can resume with the next panel and play back some time. But before then, thanks again to our panelists. We found a hotel card in this room, so if anyone's lost their hotel swipe card, it's being held out at the back of the room there now by our specialist person. Go and claim it.
Okay, we could make our way back to sitting down. The next panel session is going to be everyone. There's mine.
See you later. See you later. Thank you.
Okay, so this second session is designed to kind of open the conversation out a little bit, and I'm delighted we've got three different perspectives. Anne, who kind of bridges both the book and the policy and practice world. Holly, who is both the funder, policymaker, there's also someone who's been in the arts for a very long time. Lara, who similarly has got that kind of crossover between sort of the world of practice and policymaking and the perspective as a freelancer as well. I'd like, if I could, to get you to introduce yourselves with maybe a kind of a couple of minutes just sort of reflecting really, partially on what you've heard today already, but really on this kind of central question of what's been the impact of the pandemic on the cultural sector from your point of view. So if we start with you, Anna.
It's a pleasure. Hasn't. Nice to see you all. Thanks for the invite. Yes, I'm Anne Torjani. I'm the CEO of the Audience Agency. I'm also an associate of the Centre for Cultural Value, and my team did a great job on the cultural participation list, which is this key bit of research that we did as part of one of the 35 researches that was happening. My job was fairly arm's length from it, but the great thing about the cultural participation list from our point of view is that we've been able to continue it because we found having this really quick source of information about what's changing at your fingertips has been super useful for us and for our huge network of organisations we work with. And I wrote some bits of the chapters on audiences as well. So yeah, in that sense, I'm a bridging person. And I was just reviewing some of the things that we talked about, particularly in the book, and some of those big changes, and a lot of the things which you covered masterfully in the last session. But I think, the things that the lasting impact for me is this thing around, all the small strides that perhaps we had been making towards a more inclusive, sector with, sort of some optimism, I think, around those things, just how much that kind of we got pulled back. And I think, we'll talk about this in a moment, I'll save my thoughts on this, but I think the sector is in such a difficult place at the moment that it feels, I want to try and think of some upbeat things to say. But I think we're finding ourselves, it did create, the haves and have-nots, the gap got bigger, and I think we've got to do something monumental to really change those trends again. On the other side, though, the thing that I was always excited about was the idea that we were in a giant experiment, and I think we did get to experiment with some really good things, so I want to come on to look at those. Holly.
Great, yes. Hi, it's really, really nice to be here with everyone in person, and it all takes me back to the time when we could never be in person, and I think that makes it feel even more powerful to be together today. I'm Holly Donner, and I'm the Director of Strategic Learning, Insight and Influence at the Paul Hamlin Foundation, which sort of means I look after our research, evaluation, communications work. I've been there getting on for 4.5 years. I actually started on the 1st of June 2020, which was a really kind of cool, it really sticks in the mind, that date. And for 10 years I worked for A New Direction before that, which is a cultural education charity based in London, and then before that I worked for the Arts Council also for about 10 years. So in lots of ways my mind has gone back to those, this whole session has brought my mind back to those sort of early days, and for me that was a real transition from working for a small charity, about 20 people, focused on children and young people, and we were just in the business of sort of doing the doing, like everyone is and was, and then I sort of transitioned into this much more sort of corporate institutional funding environment, and I should also say by way of introduction, we were one of the core sort of founding partners of Centre for Cultural Value, that is PHF, and obviously I work with Ben sort of closely in terms of that funding relationship and sort of the policy recommendations from the report. Do you want me to go into my reflections now, Dave, or do you want to wait and introduce?
Try and give us just a quick intro, Lara.
Yeah, so I'm Lara Naraja. I kind of missed some of the lockdown bits, I miss not having to see, I'm a freelancer, I can say what I like. And I mainly miss having to sort of see so many people in this sector, because they're not other than you obviously, but because the thing that I'm potentially, so there's people actually that I worked all the way through lockdown with Anne, and in fact, if you just Google it, I think we're on every panel going. And if I'm not on with you, I'm on a panel with Dave. And there's no other person of colour in the whole of the cultural sector, apparently. But the thing I think for me was actually that I was on Eric. So I'm a freelancer, but I was also in the public sector, so I have a policy sort of side of it, particularly in the West Midlands. I was on Area Council with the Arts Council, I'm now on the Regional Council of the National Trust, and also I worked in a university and I work with the university, so you kind of have a different perspective. And for me, it was just one, I mean, I think as a freelancer I lost £11,500 worth of work, which I suddenly remembered, in the first 2 weeks, which is huge because then you've got no other income that's not being replaced by any other thing. But also at the same time, you talk about the Danny John was about the civic role of organisations. Well, freelancers were doing that, because particularly if you were from a global majority, and Stephen's nodding, particularly if you were working with people that were minoritised, they did not go to institutions, they came to people like me. And at one point, there was myself and a number of colleagues who were just supporting people who were applying for Arts Council's emergency funding, because they weren't going to go to institutions that had no relationship with them beforehand. So I have quite a conflicted relationship with all of that. But also, I also volunteered in food bank. That was a result of Brexit. I was just tired of being angry, so I wanted to do something really practical. We had to close all I do, everything is in response to anger. But it isn't energy, as John Michael said. So we had to close food bank down, and so I then worked and run a community food service. And what that has shown me was, if you think the inequalities in the cultural sector about, you should see what the actual world looks like in one of the most affluent suburbs of Birmingham. And so as a result of that, actually, since lockdown, I've come off every single one of my cultural boards in Birmingham, because I can just turn around and write a bid for a food charity rather than do it for an arts organisation. And I do that, but it also means that I have a much better view of why people don't participate in culture, which is not linked to NPOs or anything like that. So I have a quite conflicted relationship with the fact that there's some great arts organisations, there's some great things, there was a lot more that didn't. And so I've seen that kind of like all of that laid bare. We talked about, theoretically this is what happened, this were the inequalities. Well, the inequalities were people ringing me up because they had no money to buy food in the arts sector. So that's a real thing. So I'm kind of like, I've chosen not to be parts of the sector I've had nothing to do with.
I mean, just on that participation question, I'm just going to come to you, Anne, because I know in the book, obviously, there's a lot of discussion of participation and what happened, but also you carried on, doing this kind of work. And one of the questions we sort of set up in the panel was a sense of, well, where are we now? And it'd be interesting to hear you pick up on that, I guess, kind of question, but also sense really of continuity and change.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of different trends happening, but I think certainly the kind of some of the sort of big demographic differences, in a sense, I think there's been it's more of a mixed picture. I think some of those, there are certainly some groups, particularly. So there's a lot about generational life stage that comes through. So there's definitely. Immediately post-pandemic, there was quite a lot of demand for people with children at school or young age to get out and go and do things, and they were the first people back out to get surprises about why that might have been. And actually, that was because there's always this link between kind of, you get a sort of flatter demographic mix of people wanting to do work with children is something, all sorts of reasons for that. So that was a really positive thing, except of course there's never enough things to do. There wasn't then and there isn't now. And actually we have seen an increase in some of those, some of the groups that you see as being sort of, family life stage, but from less privileged backgrounds. And there's actually quite an increase of those people around at the moment, which is kind of really interesting, almost as though that kind of, that first wave we saw people coming back and doing more things and then dropping off a little bit because of the cost of living crisis. But also those are quite often offers that aren't that expensive and so on, and there's been a lot of pressure, there just isn't quite enough of them too. So that in a sense is quite positive. That's the only real peak, I think, where you're seeing a sort of change in the inequality gap, which hasn't really closed. The other big thing is around age. So we saw lots of indications, you see them all the way through the book, about differences for the under 35s audiences, different responses to digital, different responses to hybrid, different responses to working from home and how that impacted what they were doing. And certainly they were the kind of big wave of people that first came out and were doing more things. Big drop-off because cost of living crisis, because they're very badly affected, haven't really bubbled back up. So you've got this mix between younger audiences, keen, latent interest, perhaps not always the right kind of product out there for them, but actually still kind of not quite coming back up to where we were expecting it to be. But actually, certainly, they are now representing a higher proportion of the audience overall, but actually quite a significant, there were quite a lot of people of that sort of boomer generation who were saying they were not going to come back, and actually they haven't, and if they have, it's much less frequently. So this is not the super attenders, this is not the people that, this is their lifestyle, this is what they do. This is a whole generation of people who, they're fairly regular attenders, but not frequent. A lot of those people have stopped coming. And if you look at the big numbers overall, that looks like a sort of a net 10% decrease in audiences. And if you talk to cultural organisations, that fits what a lot of them are experiencing. Depending where you are, that could be up to 20% of your core audience has just disappeared, and you can really feel that. So it's a bit static, that one, but some quite interesting. Some of these things have got a very long tail. And I think coming back to the thing I was saying about what's the legacy in terms of what we learned. I think this idea that we were suddenly all innovating furiously was really interesting. And for us, we've been talking for quite a long time about boom again. What's going to happen when the baby boomer generation are the mainstay of audiences for lots of organisations? What happens when that starts to have a real impact on who your audiences are? We think, therefore, the pandemic sort of has hastened some of the effects of boom again, as my colleague likes to call it. But actually, the innovations that people were trying out, different ways of programming, getting closer. I think there's some conclusions in the book around getting closer to audiences, co-designing with them. A lot of that's kind of dropped away, and I kind of want to be saying, let's get back into it. We learned such a lot. How can we rekindle that spirit?
Yeah, I'm going to come to you, Holly, next, but just to pick up on that, it was really striking that there was a real moment where disabled audiences who had long struggled, even if you had the right demographics, particular levels of education, particular kinds of professional backgrounds, where you'd expect those audiences to be, highly engaged. They weren't for various access reasons. The pandemic gives them access, and then all of a sudden organisations are like, all that stuff we did, we'd like to stop doing that because we want business as usual, the return to normal. And the loss of innovation is both, sort of sad, morally problematic, but at the same time, as you say, it raises real questions about organisational sustainability. Holly?
Yeah, absolutely. Did you say boom again? Was that the word? I love that. Wow. Yeah, it's bad, isn't it? You have to be careful. When I was thinking about this, my mind kept going back, as it has many times over the last few years, to a conversation I had. I think it was maybe the day before we closed the office at a new direction, and it was that weird time. Everything was confusing and strange, but we still didn't really know what was going on. And I was talking to a colleague that I was working with who worked for a very large institution that should remain nameless, and I think would be a sort of crown jewels, that awful terminology which I remembered today. And we just had a conversation that wasn't to do with COVID, but it was sort of walking to the tube station. Do you think we all do too much in the sector? Do you think we all programme too much? Do you think we're all trying to put on too many exhibitions, too many things? Do you think we're all working too hard? Do you think there's just too many empty seats, too many productions, too many? And I remembered that conversation through the years after, because we didn't know what was going to happen. But then it was like, I felt like I'd sort of brought what happened into being by having this transgressive conversation, because it was almost like God's way of saying, you said that we were doing too much and now we're doing nothing, and it was almost like we've been smited for saying the unsayable. And even when we had the conversation, I remember it feeling very transgressive to even just mention the idea that more might not be better, that actually more stuff was perhaps something that we needed to look at. And I think one of the other reasons I kept coming back to that conversation is I look at my own career, and I just think how so much of what I've done, maybe not so much now, but certainly up to that point, was all in the pursuit of growth. It was all in the pursuit of fundraising. How do we get more money in for next year? How do we get more money in to do that thing? Or it was, how do we get the government to give us more money to do this thing? How do we expand the sector? How do we keep the sector growing? How do we connect to the creative industries and tell a story that we're all industry and we're all going to make money? And, it was like a sort of personal reckoning with, what the hell? And especially if you put that into the bigger sort of context of climate change and, the sort of degrowth agenda from that perspective. And I guess for me, sort of COVID, a bit as we're saying, we had those conversations, didn't we? And it's in the research, absolutely in the research. Actually, what are we trying to do here? What is the purpose of all of this? Who are we? Who do we serve? What is it all about? And that, for me, was the most sort of powerful bit of COVID. It was that sense of collectively having those really important conversations. And I was thinking about, Arundhati Roy's really famous essay that she wrote, Pandemic is a Portal, which is all about this idea of when you step through a portal, when you go through something like that, you have to discard the things that no longer serve you. You can't waste the crisis. You have to say, this is a moment of rupture. We discard what no longer serves us and we walk through the portal into something better. And I was thinking about all of that today and just thinking, have we done that? We certainly exposed all the stuff that doesn't serve us, all of the inequality, all of the structural racism, all of the low pay, all of the practices, all of the kind of running on empty that's reliant on exploitation. Have we stepped through and discarded that? I don't know. I think it's an open question. And I guess I think there is something really hopeful in having had those conversations, having this conversation. So perhaps sounds like I'm negative, but I think that mirror is powerful and we can still sort of step through it.
I mean, I can see itching to come.
I'm questioning who the we is in this conversation actually, because if you look at anyone, all that happened in the pandemic is that what everyone knew was that were minoritised by the sector and the wider society and everything was that it was everyone else noticed. That was all. It's always been there, and actually there's a lot of talk about we. But we still have actually, all of this was perpetuated on an absolutely unequal framework. So the cultural sector has been built on inequality and inequity, and growth is perpetuated on the exploitation of always marginalised people. So who knew that relying on the same people, older white people, to go and prop up the cultural sector was going to come back and bite everyone? There's been an absolute willful disregard actually about people from marginalised communities, and other than outreach programme or community programmes or things like that. And what's been really interesting is that, and I always disagree with it every time we do this on the panel, but I say the people from marginalised communities didn't, their consumption of cultural product did not decrease. The consumption of Arts Council funded product that's always been the case. If you look at non-formal, non-funded kind of cultural production, especially around broadcast, look at, I'm going to bring up Bridgerton, look at Bridgerton streaming data, look at Netflix, look at Apple, that content and things online that are being produced by people from marginalised communities, that has increased. So we're still sitting here, and I'm absolutely with Anne, where did all the innovation go? So people went back to things that perpetuated inequality, and we can talk about degrowth, and we can talk about climate change, all of which are still predicated on exploiting people from the global majority anyway, who, by the way, they all left the building, literally, and they're going and creating their own spaces, or were sitting in a theatre that works with particularly young people from the global majority. So this is a new way of making work, and I think what I have seen in very small pockets but it's outside of all arts council funding structure is the innovation is coming from people who want to see more funding that looks like that. It's been consumed by them and it's been made by them. And I think that's the bit that is really exciting. And I kind of look at some of the things that happen and they're all going Manchester examples, because Manchester did do much better than any of the city. Was I don't know if anyone saw United We Stream when that was on. And, you know, you're sitting there on a Saturday watching Roisin Murphy in a living room performing, and they raised about 100,000. That's a very Manchester example. I'm not quite sure that would. I don't think the Hacienda online would work anywhere else other than having 50-year-old ravens in their kitchen in Manchester. But those things were of their time, but they've adapted. They've moved on to other things. And I think that kind of excitement about experimentalism, that's what's only happening in tiny little pockets. Because I agree with them, I think that innovation went out the window the minute everyone wanted to go back to buildings again. And I don't think...
Yeah, at the institutional level, yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right, though, at the institutional level, because everyone's kind of fighting for those little pots of money and the kind of usual, so...
But they're fighting for the same audience, so it's ever-decreasing circles, because actually, there's an audience over here, or there's an audience...
It's just doing it themselves,
yeah.
That comes down
So...
I might stay with Lara on this, because I'm intrigued by, so, what do organisations do in this setting? One of the things, I mean, it's a shameless plug now I've got the microphone, but one of the ways we conclude Culture is Bad for You, which is another MUP book sort of in this space, is by saying there's a dilemma between the kind of legitimising function of institutions, making it at the National Theatre, having a production backed by the BBC, gives you a kind of legitimacy, it gives you a sense of kind of place, a sense of being given the kind of stamp of you've made it, versus that sense of these institutions have so many problems, we should just start again and do something different. And I'm intrigued by how you've highlighted those kind of moments of innovation that are going on outside of institutions. What should institutions do? Is it enough for them to say we'd like to kind of catch you a bit? Is it enough for Netflix to offer small bursaries to global majority productions, or I mean, do we need something else?
But I don't think it's binary. I think you can't just say, well, all people with global majorities are not allowed to go in direct to national. But I think you can make work differently. That's the point, is that we're still going back to making work in the same kind of way. And I think that was the baby boomer period, the Chris Smith era of free culture, and the New Labour then. That's gone, and we're never going to have that level of investment again. But if we collaborate more, and I think these are all things that came out in the research, particularly in the presentations earlier, the more people collaborated, the more you get a diversity of opinion, a different perspective, plurality of content, rather than let's go back and make the same work in the same kind of way. And I think that's what the culture sector does very badly. It's one or the other. It's never, let's expand it. And it should never be about funding. What happens to creativity? But what we have got is creativity that it's absolutely looked through a very monocultural lens, and therefore everything is being perpetuated in that kind of way. But the interesting stuff's on the margins. But it's not minor. Do you know what I mean? Margins and fringe does not mean small audiences. Bridgerton's opening streaming data was something like 65 million for season 1, and it plays out in all of the global territories. It's 50% women, it's a third Black and Latinx, and it's also Gen Z. These are all the audiences, cultural organisations keep consulting with me and saying, can you ask us how to diversify our audience? And I'm like, watch Bridgerton, there you go. I don't do that, and so, I've got a day rate, by the way. And it's not just, Bridgerton's not without, it's what I'm saying is, there's just such a binary way of looking at things all the time. And also that all people of colour are the same, or queer people are the same, or the same people are the same. We have different experiences. And the other thing I was going to add also is that since lockdown, you've got a whole different generations of young people that are kind of aging different things, have had different life experiences. The whole kind of issue around mental health of young people through lockdown has been, so we can't treat everything as if it's these are the amazing arts council age groups, 1924, 1960, all those things, they don't fit anymore. And if you look at generational migration, for example, we can't just talk about, in Birmingham, I've used the Birmingham example, all South Asian people are the same. Absolutely all of us. I don't like smokers. It's like a thing now in Birmingham that people get really scared that there's a smoker in the room, and they apologise to me because I've made out that we don't have to like them. No, it's true. The whole most things got big now. But I'm shy on Tamil, so I don't have the same kind of lived experience. Somebody asked me about partition. I'm from Sri Lanka. Why would I know about partition? You know. So Ben's got a bigger experience with Sri Lanka than most of the people I know in Birmingham. So I think those sort of things are now the opportunity to be much more nuanced and thoughtful about, and that makes for really exciting programming. I will try and be optimistic, but I also think that the power and the agency it's a really outmoded model because people are kind of creating their own work and ignoring all those power structures anyway.
I mean, I saw you nodding and agreeing, Holly, and not to put you sort of on the spot and be very, so with your PHF hat on, but with your PHF hat on, what does, I suppose, that kind of emerging mode of cultural production mean in the context of a policymaker or funder?
I think certainly from our perspective as a funder, so I kind of couch this in, you know, we're one of the larger trusts and foundations funding the arts in the UK. And we spend about £8 million a year, £8 million a year. It is not a huge amount of money. It is not a large number of grants. So, you know, the trust and foundation sector as a funder is actually pretty marginal, but it's also exciting because it's sort of unfettered. And, you know, we've, over the last few years, we've sort of really completely sort of changed the way that we sort of do our funding and the kind of welcome that we try and provide. And actually what that's meant is that I was just reading a paper today on sort of some analysis of the recent kind of arts grants coming in from the arts programme, and totally agree with Laura. You know, we are seeing a kind of, there is an extraordinary network of organisations and people and collectives and entities who don't structure themselves in ways that have sort of labels on them that say NPO or arts organisation or charity or, you know, but they are doing extraordinary, interesting, exciting work and finding ways to do it. You know, so that sort of sense of the kind of scarcity abundance dichotomy is quite interesting, and there is no shortage of extraordinary work out there that people are doing, and that they need to kind of find different kind of routes to resource, I think. And I think, you know, we like, it's certainly from our perspective, it's definitely at the intersection of sort of social change, activism, different kinds of business models, different kinds of collectives, and actually bringing in the word art is often quite sort of problematic. I think any of those kind of categories are quite problematic. And it's not particularly about, I would say that, you know, there's lots of younger people doing it, but it's not really about age. And also we're finding incredible organisations that are totally reinventing, you know, the notion of the arts centre in the Shetlands or in Northern Ireland, or, you know, like, so I think there is real cause for optimism. I think with our last round, I think like 50% of the people that we're funding, we've never funded them before, that we've never spoken to them before. So, you know, what does that mean? I think it just means that kind of creativity finds a way, and it's not our job as funders to create sort of hoops for people to jump through and categories to put people in. Our job is to find, you know, interesting work to support and to do the work to find it, not to expect people to do the work to find us. I think from a sort of wider kind of, what does that mean from a sort of broader kind of policy perspective? Absolutely, on the other side, as it were, and with my hat as, you know, we work across lots of different charities and different sectors. The third sector, the civil society sector, is really struggling with burnout. You know, we do have emerging leadership crises all over, and nobody really knows what that's going to mean, because a kind of system collapse in the civil society zone is problematic for everyone, you know, because they are supporting...
That's quite a euphemism, problematic.
Yeah,
disastrous.
you know, like you see what happened over the summer. You know, who was there to support communities and to try and sort of do anything positive in the context of the far-right violence? You know, we are all in different ways sort of reliant on a whole ecosystem of very fragile charities, and I would say leaders in particular are really sort of struggling to know how to navigate the next few years. And I don't know, and I don't suppose anyone really knows, is that sort of state of feeling like you're sort of navigating from one crisis to another if you're running a small charity or an entity of some kind, is that the new normal? Do we just have to say that's how it is now? Or is there a more sort of settled position? I don't think anyone really knows, but I do think we have a persistent, perennial problem with trying to firefight whilst we've got massive structural inequalities, massive systemic challenges, massive needs to change the system radically, and we don't have the headspace to do that thinking, and we find it really hard to do that thinking collectively, and government isn't going to do that thinking. Government's not set up to do that. I mean, it might be able to do it in pockets, but government is right at the front line of most crises. So we've got to bridge that gap if we're going to not, just be hamster wheel.
There's a sort of specific question I want to put to you, Anne, actually, before we open it out to Q&A, but feel free to respond to Holly as well.
I just want to say something that seems a really important thing that's coming through. I was fascinated by what John was saying about, sorry, there was a point to this, I'll come back, there's a connection with what Holly was just saying, but it's actually what you're saying about what was happening in Northern Ireland, that this is a place in which there is a kind of a tide of, there's a crisis, we have all kinds of troubles in our community, we know how to come together when we need to come together, like the platform's burning, we get together, we do stuff together in a network way, and then, we kind of all relax and start competing with each other again. I mean, and I think, I just really like what you said about, don't waste the crisis, the dirty right thing about, I think that's right. I think, when I keep thinking about all those networks, that sort of generative, supporting each other thing that was happening, I think that is also, there's more thinking of yourself as a platform kind of, if you're an institution, you can be a platform in an enabler. You don't have to own it all, you don't have to do it all. You can, this idea, the thing that I was talking about small organisations doing, can you enable them to do that better? Just don't get in their way. You don't have to own it. You don't have to, you don't have to have a colonial version of what that looks like. And I think the thing for me that I feel most depressed about in a way is the idea that we've all retreated from this place of supporting each other. And I do think that is a little bit what happened. I thought, maybe that's just what happens, and you should accept it. But I think they're always incentivising and making, we have systems which encourage you to compete with each other, right? There are ways of helping ecosystems flourish. And I was just loving what, Ben, you're talking about what's happening in Manchester, that actually there are habits in Manchester about working on an ecosystem. They're small, they're doing it anyway, because it's sort of worked for them in the past, which contrasts quite nicely with work. And I do think there's something around, you use the word ecosystem here for saying that, I do think, could we not actually start to think of ourselves as really more egalitarian ecosystems and take responsibility? If you've got institutional power and money, your job is to platform, not to, it's just, that kind of idea. We're almost there, and it's just, can we keep that conversation going? Sorry.
No, I was going to ask you a question about research, but that I feel would kind of kill the mood. We'll have sort of 5 minutes or so for questions, but before I sort of throw the mic out to the audience, I don't know, last words is a terrible phrase, isn't it? But is there anything in terms of a kind of final comment, quick summary, go with Lara, Holly, and then back to you, Anne?
It's going to happen anyway. I think the thing is while we're sitting there, arguing about whether these structures are right or not, it's happened. I've spent much of the summer working with BAMED and the University and Liberal Arts organisations, and particularly that was just looking at the fact that we're talking about global diasporic audiences now and how they consume culture, how they look at broadcast, how they convergent media. That's gone, So I actually think the arts organisations and the cultural sector needs to kind of change how it's working, and it needs to catch up with where the rest of the world has gone. And I think, that presents a challenge, but it's how you look at it. So either you look at it as an amazing creative opportunity to stop doing this really tokenistic, instrumentalist community working at communities, because it's so dull and it's so annoying, or we kind of co-produce and we co-create in lots of different ways. But also I think Paul Hammond's a really good example of how it's changed funding. Arts Council could probably do a bit more of this. Is more experimentation. That whole success and failure binary doesn't work. What happens to being able to make work and see where it landed? And if it doesn't have successful audiences, then it might not happen like that. You know, so I think there's a much more interesting way of looking at that. I think there has to be much better understanding of what cities and towns look like now. They don't look like what everyone keeps thinking they look like. When we had all the racist violence in all the different cities, it was really, I mean, again, coming from Birmingham, which is a non-white majority, and people in the art sector just assumed Asian people all Asian people live together, you know, in one big house like the Beatles, and they were only in Spark Hill or here, and I was like, why don't they go right in Harbour and take out all the dentists, you know, or Solihull where I'm from, you know, which is it's all doctors in my family. So there's the assumption of that othering of what whiteness looks like in the cultural sector, and that's not necessarily ethnicity, that is just quite vanilla ways of making work. That's the bit that's got to kind of really address itself, because it is happening over here. But so I think there's a really great opportunity, and I think the people that don't take that opportunity, is it any great loss?
I think I would totally agree with all of that. I think there's something about, this is a really important moment. I'm going up to Liverpool next week for the Labour Party conference. It's been a hell of a summer, hasn't it, from the perspective of politics, and just looking at what's happening in Europe and what might be happening in America this year. It's a hell of a year in terms of politics. I guess what I mean is, I think there's some very big picture stuff to attend to over the next few years, which is about what kind of society do we want to be and how do we build that together. And that's about, you know, in policy terms, that's about education policy, it's about how we rebuild local government, it's about equity and not having, you know, huge polarities of wealth, it's about, you know, proper taxation, it's about those values and sort of sticking with that, and what does that mean. I think all of that is really important, and we all kind of have a role in that. I don't know what that role is, you know, and I don't think it's for the cultural sector to kind of try and charge in and sort of solve those things, because it can't, but it has a role. So I think there needs to be some sort of circling around those things to get to a stronger sort of position. And yeah, and I think for the sector, as Laura says, it's you know, it's getting on with the creativity and the soul. You know, that's what it should be about, and doing that with integrity and authenticity, and sort of finding a way, as we always do, and not, I guess, being too drawn into unhelpful ideas that somehow the Arts Council is going to fix everything, or if I was an MPO I'd be better. You know what I mean? It's like that thinking doesn't serve the times, I don't think. Yeah, it's not that.
I disagree with all those wise thoughts, these wise women who just said, but I think there's something, you're right, I like all the stuff over here. I like this idea. I like the idea there's all this stuff up here. And I like somewhere in the middle of that, you've got to find a place where you can be useful. So for me, it's a little bit about, with a bit more listening, a bit more finding a place for yourself if you work in the cultural sector, and doing it with others who are not the same usual crowd. I think that's a sort of this idea of utility, a different meaning of utility. This idea of being much more an enabler of things, which we learned a little bit how to do. I'd like to see us going back to.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got maybe time for one or two questions, and then we're going to open it out into a much more sort of general conversation around the room, but specifically for the panel. So there's one in the middle there.
Thanks so much. Again, congratulations. Fantastic event, fantastic table, taking these reflections. I'm Steve Dobson from the Centre for Cultural Value. One thing I was really keen to hear about, people have been thinking about, you know, the ecosystems and the bigger picture and the role of innovations. And I'm quite interested in the fact that from an ecosystemic point of view, many organisations will be innovating by getting bigger or smaller, or competing in ways that they didn't used to do before, and therefore competing with different people that they didn't used to compete with, collaborating with other people. At the ecosystemic level, there's all kinds of stuff going on, obviously. But in terms of a general direction, do you get the sense that organisations had that kind of reflective moment through the pandemic? That kind of existential crisis of what are we actually doing this for? And so whilst there may be all sorts of different business models changing, do we have at least an alignment, perhaps, at that kind of big picture level, of people moving in a similar direction?
So just, there's one. Were there any others? We'll take a bunch. I'll tell you what, I'll go to the lady just because she's next to you. And then I'll go to you. So yeah, go for it.
Hello, just a small point really. It struck me throughout that great discussion. Something hit me, which was that basically, if the culture is what is the culture returning to after the pandemic? It struck me it was like the British government returning to Britain, Great Britain, after the Second World War, and that of course didn't happen. Culture had shifted. The wider cultural, the identity of Britain had shifted. And continued to in quite a fast way sometimes. And that's the paradigm shift that nobody saw. So is the Arts Council, well, essentially they're outmoded in the way that they operate. All they were really doing then, the war they were fighting was to keep jobs, it wasn't for anything else.
I'll tell you what, there's one in the middle, and then we'll do one at the front, and then there's kind of 4 themes that you can pick up on.
It's just a quick, rather specific one around. I keep coming back to this business of the missing 10 or 20%, whichever the figure is, because obviously a figure that big is the difference between survival and not survival for lots of organisations. Should we care? Is it a lost cause? Is there a way of reconnecting with them? What should we think about them?
Do you want to make a quick mental note of that?
I was just wondering if you think that part of the problem might be that in terms of institutions and stuff that they can be quite risk averse, and I think that when there's so much emphasis on funding streams and stuff, it's like with government investment, it's a BCR, benefit cost ratio, and you throw the money at the place that's going to give you the quickest investment. So shit at middle, essentially, like the money goes where you're going to get a quick return. And I think that in terms of like arts funding, do you think that that contributes to the issues with diversity, because they don't want to take risks on things like you were saying, Lara, the stuff that is happening, it's experimental, it's different, but it's almost like things aren't allowed to fail, so you're losing that thing of organisations might not want to take a risk on something because they think that it's not going to get the funding, or if it does get some funding from a big institution and then it's seen that it doesn't succeed because it doesn't get the numbers that it's supposed to generate for the funding bid or something like that. Do you think that that kind of risk aversion affects it, like it does in publishing, where if a publisher, big publisher, can't guarantee that they're going to sell 100,000 units, they're not going to take a chance on a diverse voice, whereas like a much, much smaller press that's not beholden to the shareholders kind of will, and that's why you see much more diversity of voices in smaller publishing.
So lots, four different, but actually quite interconnected questions that you can pick and choose from.
I mean, I think that last question, I actually personally think there's a really willful decision not to do diversity. I've been having this conversation for I don't even know how many years we've been through having this conversation in the cultural sector, and the data doesn't change. So it's not. I don't think it's about competing for funding. Because when I started working in the sector, running a European programme, it was an £8 million programme, and we were talking about diversity then, and that was 2004, 2005. So I'm quite bored. I've just stopped talking about it. Close go and do it and work with people that I want to work with. But then I've got a lot of privilege and access, so I can do those sort of have that conversation. So I think there is an absolute willful desire not to change the status quo, because that way you kind of grasp culture and this is what it looks like. Publishing is quite interesting actually, because actually if you look at there are far more kind of well-known ethnic diverse kind of writers. I go to Hay and people are like, is it ethnic diverse? I mean, yes, it's really, really middle-class audiences, but you get middle-class Asian and black people as well, so, but everyone's over here trying to do a workshop for working-class black people or something like that, I say these things, but I work, and we've seen this in the going to polarize some of the audience data that I've seen that arts organisations produce. So it's like just not wanting to look at census data, for example. So if you we're sitting in a city where it has an increasing Black African population, Black Caribbean audience has gone, populations has moved downwards. The Asian audience population is different, same as in Birmingham. Nobody knows that. Nobody looks at the fact that there's a difference between the Indian population, the Bangladeshi population, the Pakistani population in Birmingham. They just do something for a Mela or an Eid and everyone's stacking the same. You know, and that's a bit that I think that people are choosing not to have those conversations. And the reason I know so much about this is actually because I work with a lot of people who are not in the arts sector. I just dropped so many people in lockdown, and I worked with people in education, and my friends are in children's services, and so I have a better understanding of populations and how they change. But again, I still think that's a really great opportunity for more creative practice. But personally, I think people are choosing not to change their business models. But I'm quite cynical as well.
I did. So Holly, you're poised to come in.
I'm poised. Yeah, I was just because I think, and it does connect the questions to some degree. I completely agree. I think the status quo, the reason it is the status quo, it's really bloody powerful. You know, the system reverts to the status quo, and that's like to move beyond that and to really shift that is really hard. And I think it's interesting. We can argue about whether or not COVID was that thing. But if it wasn't that thing, it's like we need to then restart that conversation about what are we all, to the question around purpose, you know, what are we all in the same direction? Can we align around that idea of a regenerative sector, you know, that's talked about a lot in the research? The regenerative sector, people are not exploited. We do not have low pay. And what does that really mean for business models? Like, it's tough to run a theatre and pay people properly and put on new things all the time. So things have to be changed, and we have to see the value in that. And I think that is exciting. And, you know, I think we can sort of get there. But I think what history tells us, to the point about post-war, is, you know, it's far better to do these things in a collective, collaborative, joyful, planned way. Because if it comes down the line and it's events that force it through system collapse, well, you know, the rich people survive and the poor people get, you know. So that's, I think, what we need to consider.
Because I think the point about the British government and the Arts Council, conflated the two, was I was on Area Council for 8 years, and I absolutely loved it. I thought working with the Arts Council was great. But I spent 8 years talking about that I don't think Arts Council are the people to tell people what to do, and maybe the sector can grow a little bit, and instead of having, you know, monitoring targets against diversity, you know, I know there's a parent-child thing here, but the Arts Council had to step in because nobody changed anything in the 8 years I was on Area Council. And even if you look at the last National Portfolio Round, which has the biggest increase in diverse-led organisations, they're still just diverse-led organisations. And if I talk to any of them, because they're people I know, how much they are incorporated into the mainstream sector, they're over here still. They're diverse-led organisations, and unless somebody's doing an engagement project, they don't get to work with the more established organisations.
Do you want to wrap us up, Anne?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what an important observation that was about whether, you know, that actually we come back, you know, we haven't used the crisis to learn anything. We've come back thinking everything looks the same, because on the surface of it, it sort of still does, right? But I think that's exactly right. But maybe Laura's over here, which I'm going to keep thinking about. Laura's over here, you know, meaning exactly that we do need a pretty radical change about how we sort of think about it.
It's more fun over here.
It's more fun over there. We all want to be in the ecosystem, which is that over there, you know, in some ways. So I think that's exactly right. And I also think that there is a sort of one of the things that I'm sort of noticing at the moment is that the sort of the incentives, you know, we're the envy all over the world of people who love our funding system and the fact that it has really strong social values underpinning it, you know, theory, and, you know, actually it's transparent. We are the envy of the world. I think we should probably remember that as we're slacking all off. But anyway, but I do think there's something about a kind of a uniformity that it creates. It is transparent. Everybody has to do the same thing the same way. And if you don't want to do that, you just want to have fun and do something that's really got a massive creative drive, you probably don't want to have to jump through the hoops of an Arts Council funding application, which has this sort of uniforming factor that just takes you out of Laura's space over there, doesn't it? You know? And I also think it also is really, really competitive, and it doesn't encourage ecosystem thinking. And I think for all that placemaking is the flavour of the month, we need a different kind of funding and incentive to work in both that collective way. So I'm all for radical change. I don't know what it is, but I love it. Write something for us.
I mean, I'm hesitant to bring this to a close because, again, Holly, I sense you're poised to come in again. But we've got about maybe 20 minutes or so for this general Q&A. But before we go to that, could you just join me in thanking the panel, which has been fantastic. Yeah, I mean, there's too many of us to be on the stage at once. So, I mean, I can run around with the mic. I mean, what we could actually start with Anthony's quite useful question to you, Anne, which is our missing fifth. Should we care?
This is where I wish Ollie was here and he'd go more specifically speaking. But it is, I think broadly it is a big problem. We've seen large numbers of people who were much more frequent in the audience have stayed away, and they have not. So although the proportion of you, people keep saying, oh, we've got loads more new audiences, which what it means is that you're not retaining the audiences that perhaps you should be doing. Our audiences are proportionately, there's a high proportion of younger people in there, but the overall number is down. And we have to do something, I think, the response to that has to be to do something quite radically different, because it's a boiling frog situation at the moment.
Also, I don't think people go and engage with culture in the same kind of way. Like, you don't just go to the same things. And I was thinking, when we did the panel in March 21, I think, which the panel we did, and I'd been to Birmingham, but this is just, were we still in lockdown? March 21, I can't remember. Yes. Yeah. So, and I think in between the lockdowns, because I think the Midlands is different from Northwest, I'd been to Birmingham 3 times. So that was in 2021. So I sat last night and thought, how many times have I been back in Birmingham in 3 years? It's not much more than that. I've been to Manchester loads of times, I've been to Plymouth, I've been in Margate, that's all the last couple of months. I go out and do lots of cultural activity, I just don't do it in Birmingham. Because for me, I'd rather go and see work that is interesting, it's relevant, it looks like me, it's made by people I like. And so people, I think, are much more, there's a different value that people put on it, and some of that's cost of living, but two, I think just people want to have, not that kind of really traditional, we'll go to the theatre every single week and see the same thing over and over again.
We've got a hand. Ben, could you?
I just wanted to talk pretty little to that, because I've lived in Manchester for 20 years, but I'm actually a Brummie, and I was doing some work in Birmingham just around the Commonwealth Games, and that for me was this massive missed opportunity which was supposed to underpin all of the things that we talk about as an industry, as a cultural sector, and then the absolute disregard for black cultural creatives during that whole process that was supposed to be a celebration of culture in Birmingham alongside having the Commonwealth Games, really reinforced why I don't live in Birmingham anymore. And, people will talk to me about the differences between Birmingham and Manchester. They're sort of similar sized cities, similar kind of ethnic population, but I've never been able to work consistently in Birmingham. I could never do what I do outside of in Manchester, outside Manchester, and I've worked in Birmingham, I've worked in London, I've worked in Edinburgh, and it is about those things that we talked about, these ecosystems, but also there are sort of different little funding pots, like go to GMCA, and different spaces that just don't exist in other cities, and I was never more disappointed than I was after the Olympic Games, and that basically nothing was happening, not the Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games, and that there was nothing done with that legacy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other session than the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, but 90% of the culture programme money, which was in the millions, did not go to people from Commonwealth countries. So it basically went to white-led organisations, and the only good things about the Commonwealth Games that worked really well were the bits that I worked on, obviously, with the cultural producers, with openers who ran all of the outdoor spaces. the so-called community festivals that we worked on with emergent producers, all of whom have gone freelance, very few work in Birmingham, but we still work with them. The smallest one got 5,000 people to a community festival. That's more than some of the arts organisations get. Because obviously people, when you talk about hyperlocal, all that kind of stuff, people love to see culture in their spaces. But maybe they should listen to the two people that wrote their Race Equality Action Plan, but they didn't. That was me, by the way. And they ignored it, so there you go. But I think what actually is interesting is I'm running a programme in Aberdeen based on how not to do it. So all of we actually took the Commonwealth Games as a model of how not to work with communities, and we flipped it, and we're now looking at community-led projects where we capacity build communities, and the arts organisations are invited in by those communities, not parachuted in the other way around.
Are there any questions that aren't about Birmingham? I'm going to be really honest. Could you pass the microphone? Oh, thank you.
Hi, I'm Marge Ainsley, I'm a freelance evaluator. I'm interested in the panel's view about the future of freelancing, and I'm really interested in reading about the journey of freelancing during the pandemic. Some of you will remember the Museum Freelance Network, which doesn't exist anymore, but we did a lot of research during the pandemic and before about how we can deal with some of the inequities in freelancing in the cultural sector. Deal with things like low fee rates which don't meet the living wage, global majority freelancers being paid a lower fee, poor briefs, all sorts of stuff that goes on with freelancing. And it's interesting you talked about libraries before. Essentially during the pandemic, libraries bankrolled my income during the pandemic. I guess I'm interested in how you see the freelance landscape now. I'm trying to be a bit more positive about, are there any lessons during the pandemic and the things that we raised during the pandemic around those issues that freelancers face, not just, and this is no disregard to freelancers working in theatres, the lighting techs, all of those people who, as well as the arts and heritage consultants, for example, freelancers working in archive services, libraries, we all, not all of us, but a lot of us weren't paid during the pandemic because we weren't eligible for grants. What have we learned? What's changing? What's next for freelancing in the cultural sector? Because certainly anecdotally in the work that a lot of us do and we see every day with our colleagues, we are still seeing poor briefs, we are still seeing poor fees, we're still seeing those inequities and inequalities.
I was going to say actually, some of the academic team can pick up on this because we've got data, etc. But it'd be interesting to hear from you, Laura.
I don't know. Well, I'm a freelancer. I would say I recognise that my privilege and access in this space, and I don't really have to tender for work or anything like that. But if you've been an ex-public funder, you tend not to have to do those sort of things. I think there's a real issue, and I don't know all the data on theatre. There was a theatre task force on freelancing, and I know there's a big percentage of people that have left the sector, so I think there's a huge skills shortage. Everyone kept talking about the value of freelancers during lockdown, and it felt very special, but I don't really see that anything's really changed. I mean, like Steve and I were kind of occupying the same space as you, I think. But I think if you're very much like employed by theatres or galleries and technicians, stuff like that, the West Midlands also has a lot of boot camps around theatre technicians, for example, and gallery technicians. But we haven't got the infrastructure to, so all we're doing is pushing people again at this end. And I still think I would not want to go to freelance like how I did before. There's no way you can do it now. Coming into this sector is really hard, I think, and because it's just not sustainable. And people want more for less as well. And the expectation I think for freelancers is that you will work all hours. Nobody works their day rate or anything like that. And I think the freelancers were the forgotten kind of people within lockdown. £2.5 grand for an arts council emergency grant did not get you through the whole lockdown. So that sounds really depressing. The thing I do think that's more interesting is, and I do this when Stephen does it as well, is that you work collaboratively. So I tend to work only in association with a number of freelancers, and that makes it, I like it, it's much more, you spread the risk at the start, but also I get to do more interesting work, it becomes a kind of learning thing for me. I work with people like the audience agencies as an associate, and those sort of things have been great, because I get to expand my knowledge and my network. So I think that's, and the other thing is also being more multidisciplinary. I think that's where the future of freelancing will be.
I mean, it's worth saying a few things, both as a shameless plug for the book, because we talk about freelancers quite a lot in the book, and I believe the book is reasonably priced and you could probably write it off as a business expense as well. But I think a positive story might be that, and this has come up several times actually across all the discussions, is this idea that the pandemic made what everybody knew really clear in a way that is kind of undeniable, because both organisations and the kind of broader social structure and public policy environment had to respond to it. So in some ways we're at a point, I think, where all of the infrastructure now knows freelancers exist in a way that it probably didn't before. And a lot of the kind of hidden labour, a lot of the issues around working conditions, exploitation, the list you've outlined is now present in ways that funders are taking seriously things like what is the day rate. At the same time, it's clear that this is not kind of washing through the system properly. So I think that challenge of, people are aware of this now, so what happens next is the point we're at. The other thing I think that's important to stress is many of the issues that we encountered in the pandemic for freelancers were nothing to do with freelancers in the arts, and were basically to do with the fact that Britain doesn't have a functioning welfare state. It has a punitive set of measures that are designed to punish people who fall out of work and fall out of employment. And I think that kind of broader landscape is something that's up in the air with the new government. They've made various commitments around certainly work. They've made fewer commitments around how the welfare state operates. But, this, I think, kind of bigger issue is something, and thinking about, to kind of wrap up what I was saying, those moments actually where, Holly Ann and Lara have talked about the intersections between civil society organisations and the arts, or, the idea of culture being done every day by people who have nothing to do with NPOs. I think one of the things that might be productive here is to link the presence and awareness of freelancers with the need for a proper welfare state, and that might be a kind of landscape or a territory to campaign on. I don't know if Ben, Abi, you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I think I wanted to pick up on that, not to take it back to the Manchester versus Birmingham battle that we had earlier, but that kind of taking notice and keeping notice was one thing I wanted to mention. I went to the Manchester Cultural Strategy launch last week, and it was really palpably different in tone and address and content from ones that I've seen the cultural ambition of the cultural leaders of Manchester say, 10 years ago, and people who've been working in Manchester for as long as I have or longer will kind of know what I'm on about in terms of the references to institutions, the references to cultural leaders, and the lack of reference to people and communities and democracy and so on. Or democracy, cultural democracy being held up as a kind of shining example, but then not acted on in practice. And freelancers was very much part of that kind of narrative. What the actual action plan is, I can't say, and how it folds out, but I just was really, I found it quite remarkable, the change of that. And I think Ben Adami would probably also have things to reflect on in terms of how we saw the resources and the support for freelancers, partly sometimes slightly in Schadenfreude because certain organisations will base their business model on precarious freelancers, and then suddenly needed to show them love when they could no longer give them any money. I'm not going to mention any names, but you're probably also aware of who they are too. So I think there's something about the keeping notice, but also, as you were saying in the last panel, all of you brilliantly, that kind of systemic change, and that ties into today's point about, it's a broader issue, it's a broader structural issue. So much like the Arts Council post-war, is it still relevant? Does the light bulb want to change? It's going to be difficult to turn this tanker around, but maybe by keeping notice and then by finding other models and ways of supporting people in an equal, egalitarian way, we can do this through welfare, but it's very knotty. And the final point I wanted to make was that, we have in the project, and I remember it was an early piece of work that John, you led on along with Rachel, which was looking at other models of responses from countries elsewhere, where they looked at basic income. Now, there's a lot of discussion, basic income for artist models in some, or different ways of states supporting people through hardship. And, I think there's still much work to be done. So it's about the kinds of things we were talking about in the last panel, about being brave and thinking and experimenting and finding new ways of policy supporting planning for the infrastructure for people to do what it wants to. So yeah, those were my points. I don't know if anyone from the team wanted to pick up on that, or if there are other questions that we want to go back to.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of at the point of wrapping up, so there's one over there and then one in the middle. All right.
Yeah, thank you. So much has been so interesting, kind of depressing for me to think about going back to those days, and I kept my job. But yes, what I want to think about was this point of what have we learned or not learned from the pandemic. Just going back to business as usual and thinking about the business as usual to what extent. I mean, yeah, Laura's absolutely right. We knew this already. Obviously, some people didn't, but lots of us knew this already. But in terms of going back to the business as usual, and as Dave was saying about that, the draw of digital access, that it's like you see that it's a choice not to offer that. It's not that we don't have the technology; it's that we choose not to. But why? Is it only about reinforcing existing exclusions? Is it about because we're invested in buildings and we've got to pay for them, so we've got to sell seats and we've got to pay people in? Or are there, are there benefits? Are there positive things that are about having a building or, placemaking, all those sorts of things? How can we, are there things that we want to keep from how things were before that we can keep whilst not just going back to business as usual and not failing to learn the lessons of the pandemic, I guess?
One more?
Yeah, just a really quick one for all of the authors and representatives. What were the biggest surprises for you in doing the research, in producing the book? Is there anything that really stands out as being something that was really unexpected?
I think the biggest one that Anne touched on that came out really early on in the research was I don't know if we expected, but we hoped that digital would really democratise audiences. And so the biggest surprise and disappointment was that it really completely failed to do that. We basically saw the same audiences engaging more. So there was that kind of, I guess without being too negative, there was a dashed hope quite early on that it wasn't going to kind of revolutionise who engaged with culture. That was my biggest surprise.
There was one more in the middle.
I could have gone into cousin of yours, but also just to say what a tremendous session this has been. All your 4 years of work and all the things you've looked at, there will be more crises that will engulf us in the years and decades to come. How much better equipped do you think we are from the learning we have or haven't done in the last 4 years to deal with the next one?
Do you want to go on that one? Or audience? Or?
I don't think I'm the right person to ask. I think that links very well to Orient's question, actually. I think that's what you're asking, really, because we can learn, but we actually have to put it into action. And I think, that's a really challenging question that I will probably pass to one of my colleagues. I just want to go back to the other one about surprises, and I don't know. I don't feel like, as researchers, we're not really looking for surprises. We're just bringing stuff in and trying to organise it into something that might be useful, but it's also about contribution to knowledge. And so I suppose it was just a comment, really not a surprise, but the resilience of people, and the way that they supported each other was not a surprise. It was just a comment that I think we need to bring back into the room. But I'm going to leave it to Dave to tell us how to fix that.
Yeah, look, the purpose of the system or an institution is what it does. So, I think we saw illustrated really usefully, and again, picking up on Holly and Lara's points, a lot of these institutions are not there to be open, accessible. You know, they're there to serve audiences, they're enmeshed in various kind of power structures, they're part of the reason why we have a failing or non-existent welfare state. And that sounds like an extreme thing to link, you know, NPOs to punitive benefit systems, but these things are all intertwined and intermeshed. And I think to pick up on that kind of, well, why don't they? Well, you know, these institutions are not there to bring in, say, you know, more people with mobility issues. They're there to sell the tickets, fill the audience. They might say they're there to do that, but clearly their behaviour suggests that they're not. So, you know, you should take seriously what systems and institutions do. I think what we've learned is a complex issue, because as social researchers, you are part of the social that you research, and the interventions you make change the thing that you're researching. So to pick up on the freelancers point again, you know, we are aware now of the need for freelancer-specific interventions. So if a pandemic happened tomorrow, the government would, you know, it would be at the top of its list, but, you know, fairly high up the list would be, hang on, we've got to think about freelancers, in a way that 4 years ago, literally nobody said, hang on, shouldn't we be thinking about freelancers? Because that just wasn't present in the data sources, in the data structures, in the research infrastructure that the state was using to construct problems that needed interventions and solutions. So in some ways, you know, we've learned a lot. In other ways, though, the nature of these crises means, by definition, we will be unprepared for them. And I think that is sort of important when you think about state capacity and planning. And I can't remember whose comment it was, but, you know, the sense of kind of fighting the last war is never a good idea. You're poised again.
Sorry, I didn't want to stop you mid-flow, Dave, but thank you. Well, I just wanted to add to what you were saying, really, which is I think Anne made the point about the network effects and this idea of platforms and connections. These are doable things that build resilience, and we should all be trying to do them in different ways. Like, this is not, that is not an impossible sort of goal, that we could build our preparation and our sort of resilience through really focusing in on just those findings. And I'd love to think about what that could look like, and I think we could make that happen. I think one of the things I've been pondering also in lots of different areas where we work is the people who are doing the doing are not necessarily the right people to be doing the infrastructure and the resilience work and the connecting tissue work and the deep tissue stuff. Who are those people in our sector? We've got some of them in the room, and they're great, but really we're weak, I think, on those roles. And where are those roles? And they'll be, you know, so I just think we should sit with that, because building that now, I think, could be really important.
I think you're right. I think we have a lot of the solutions, don't we? And some of them we try to flesh out. So we know that networks work. You know, one of our key findings was basically how well networked you were, whether as a freelancer or an organisation, pretty much determined how well you rode the wave of the pandemic. So we know they work. The question, therefore, is how to support and influence and generate and regenerate networks. And John's example of Northern Ireland is a great one. We know we need a more regenerative sector. I presented this research about 6 months ago in Germany, which obviously is a very different funding system at the moment from ours. And I got standing ovation, which sadly doesn't happen very often. they were going, no one's ever said that in Germany. There's just always been that we can do more, you know, how dare you reduce our funding. And the kind of impetus for my comment was that one director had made an observation they were going to have to cut from 14 to 12 productions a year because of a tiny reduction in funding. You know, in a regional theatre that got about 4 times what the national theatre here gets. So I dared to say, maybe we need to do a little bit less, and there was just applause in this, like, I can't believe someone's actually said that out loud. So we know, I think the question for me is how, isn't it? And again, your point, Holly, how do we walk through the portal? It isn't like we haven't got a clue what we need to do, it's just how on earth is that going to happen? And if the pandemic wasn't the impetus for that, what the hell is going to be? And maybe can we do it, as you said, in a more joyful and collaborative way. But looking at, you know, what happened after the Second World War, maybe it does need something really radical to rip it up and start again.
But what happened after the Second World War was a complete rupture around class. So I think the other thing, that come back to your point already, is about the thing we haven't really talked about, because I'm going to hold a section, and also because it refers back to what was about to you, is obviously about the networking works if you've got a class. If you've got a class network. So as possibly one of the most networked people in the cultural sector, I was in Belfast at the weekend, and I met with somebody who used to be in Manchester, who now lives in Belfast, and on the plane met somebody, he went, I don't know, is that you? And I haven't seen him for like 12 years, and he was a client from when I was at Business Link, but I have a massive network because I was a vendor. So how do you build up that network? And because that's what will change. And the thing that was really good about being online is that you didn't have to be in this space all the time. There's probably people, in fact that's how I started working up in Manchester this summer, was through somebody that I met every week online during lockdown because we were all going a bit mad. And just having people to talk to at some point was really good. So I think that one thing that digital did do was you could meet so many more people. And actually, in fact, we did loads of work online, didn't we? We were on a lot of panels together, so we also talked a lot online, and I think that's the bit that how do you make sure that if we're going to take something away from that, is actually that much more dispersed network, but also can we just get rid of the whole class structure, that's what the cultural sector has been based on. Well, it will happen again, and that's the point, because the class sector in this country, that's the reason it's different to the rest of Europe. One, we're not in Europe anymore, obviously. But two, I think the class sector, it has changed in different ethnic groupings. I'm thinking my people, not my people.
Anne was going to say something, and then Abi, if you want to wrap up.
Yeah, sorry, this is a really practical thing, and this is a whole room full of researchers, right? Because I think the other thing is that everybody got more excited about data, right? Is that not true? We all got really excited about having decent data at our fingertips, knowing what to do with it, and being able to link it with other data sets. And I hope that is going to be it. So if it happens again, back to your point, Steve, you know, if next time it happens, we're going to have really good data that's going to help us to leap forward, and not just about health, but about about what our assets are, what's working, what's not, different things like. So it's just a little, don't forget the data.
I think that's a really, really good point, actually. Having just been looking at the Zoe app this morning and thinking about that general contribution and understanding ourselves, and it's not exactly reflexive. I think the other thing, not forgetting about data, that I wanted to add, which comes back to the institution doing the purpose that it does, wrong misquoting, is, and links back to the idea about, kind of the roles for stewardship and governance in connecting. I think there's something about governance that we have also learned in the last few years, particularly in this country. We mentioned it earlier, it's an interesting time for politics. So, good governance, whose responsibility, in whose interest does it lie, and having those things aware when we're thinking about, kind of building new systems or experimenting with the old one or binning it all together. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for attending. I'd like to particularly thank again Creative Manchester and the Centre for Cultural Value for their organisation, marketing, putting together, being on a great spread, and just generally being lovely people. For all of those things, thank you. Also to Contact for hosting us, to MUP, who still, I think, have their bookstore outside with discount actual knowledge with beautiful covers.
Free online.
This book is free online. Cultural Value for you is free online. Beautiful physical objects. It's not like okay. And there's also another counterpoint book to that, which is Culture is Not an Industry by Justin O'Connor, which is another MUP publication, which I think also contributes very well to this debate. So please go out and buy books. Thank you all again, and another round of applause for our amazing panellists. Sandwiches and crisps.